is the importance of Settlement Day, and why do you feel Thomas Vincent Ramos felt such a strong need for establishing it?
Hmm. Really great question. So I actually wrote a piece on Thomas a few years ago. I was a grad student. Garifuna Settlement Day is an important day. It happens in Belize for the first time, I want to say 85, 87. And this is the time where Belize is becoming Belize, right? So Belize is one of the younger, newly independent, countries in Central America. It's the last one, right? It used to be British Honduras.
Yeah.
And now it's Belize. And Belize hasn't been a country for too long, right? I don't even think it's maybe at 35 years now, but it's a relatively still young nation, and it was trying to really kind of cement its identity as a multiracial, multicultural country. And within the Central America Isthmus, Belize and Panama actually are the two places that hold a very West Indian configuration in their identity, right? So they're both very, very West Indian, but also West Indian of like the 20th century, but also like West Indian from like the 15th and 16th century, right? So there's like Creole folks, right, who are English speaking, who are not necessarily, two generations removed from Barbados and Jamaica, but are also very much tied to those spaces as Creole people, right? Opposed to someone whose grandparents are from Barbados, right? So I say those distinctions because I think Panama and Belize in particular both hold this very multicultural, multiracial nation state. So Garifuna Settlement Day is happening in the 80s as a response to the nation state, the birth of Belize, and also saying we've been here, right? As a public performance of ancestral arrival, but also as a contemporary reminder that Garifuna communities have been here, and we've been here before the formation of the Republic. And that's an important distinction because part of how Garifuna folks will claim indigeneity is also through historical timelines, right? To be like, yep, we were here before you guys were even a republic, right? Before you guys were even a Central American nation state, we were here because the Spanish brought us here, right? Like the British exiled us, but the Spanish welcomed us and wanted our military warrior-like expertise, right? So Garifuna folks kicked ass during the wars of independence, right? But that's not in the history books, right? That's not in public knowledge. So part of Garifuna Settlement Day is to have all of that being remembered, right? Reminded, right? That the nation state, we were here prior to the formation of the nation state, and this is what our ancestors endured to get here, and this is the remembrance, right? And part of that remembrance is to have this deep public discourse and dialogue with the nation state, and that's in Belize, right? Belize is an important space because it's the space also where Garifuna culture found a home outside of mestizaje. Mm-hmm. So Garifuna folks in Belize are able to have a different relationship with their culture and language and history because Belize didn't necessarily have the dominance of mestizos, if that makes any sense, right? Mm-hmm. So the dominance of this national subject isn't what's happening in Belize. In Belize, in fact, the national subject is this multiracial. So you know how Jamaica has this whole from many one people?
Yeah.
That's exactly what Belize also imagines its nation state to be, right? Mm-hmm. So Garifuna folks were able to have a particular kind of home, right, within Belizean nationhood. What's really important to keep in mind is that Belize is also the place where UNESCO brands Garifuna culture, and particularly Garifuna language and dance, as masterpiece of intangible humanity, right? Mm-hmm. So this is the nation state that UNESCO claims as these are the Garifuna folks who have maintained their language, right? And that's only possible because of Belize's multicultural, multiracial ideology as a nation. So that would not have been possible in Honduras, even though Honduras has the largest Garifuna community.
Mm-hmm. And so did Thomas Vincent Ramos, because I know he was all about preserving and keeping the culture alive, did he play a part in Belize being such a mecca for preserving the culture? Or
Yeah, I mean, yeah, absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah, he was dubbed a civil rights activist within Garifuna life, right? Like
Mhm.
he's someone who advocated a lot for Garifuna culture and language to not be discriminated against, right? And in many ways, I've heard him being compared to like the third good marshal of Garifuna folks because part of his like advocacy was through the law, right? So a lot of his advocacy was through law. So he wasn't like a cultural worker, like a performer, like, like Aurelio Martinez, right? Who is this really internationally known Garifuna musician who uses his music as a site of activism and advocacy, but that's the only space he does that in, right? In other words, he uses his music as the vehicle for that, opposed to Thomas Ramos, right? Who would use public discourse, right? Speeches. He was a huge orator, right? Like he was someone who was a phenomenal public speaker, right? So part of that is to really highlight the different modalities of Garifuna civil rights activism, right? And he was definitely one that tapped into, I would see him more of a Frederick Douglass kind of person because of his public engagement, because he had a huge public following, right? So he was definitely part of that kind of building of Belize for sure. And who was born in Honduras, right? Born in
Yeah.
Honduras, raised in
And then
Honduras,
I think he
comes
went to
to
Belize in
Belize
his
later.
20s or something, like in his 20s.
Yeah, very similar
Yeah.
to Arturo Alfonso Schomburg, right? Schomburg comes to New York in his late teens, early 20s. Thomas does the same. And I think it's important to never forget those kind of really important histories because, what shapes him is also Honduras. Honduras shapes him, right? It shapes him politically, shapes him
Yeah.
culturally. And I think those are really, really important. They shouldn't be forgotten.